He can't possibly mean that everything that begins to exist ex nihilo, or that just begins to exist period, has a cause, because ex materia causation is the only kind of causation we know of for which this premise can be supported.
Are you really suggesting William Lane Craig believes there is no empirical support for creation ex nihilo? Of course not. You're using an argument that William Lane Craig does not agree with to make his first premise say something he does not say in order to make it look like he's committing a logical fallacy. Do you not see a problem with this reasoning?
If I understand your point correctly, Craig is saying that because he hasn't specified what kind of cause he's talking about, it's not an equivocation. I don't think that's what the quote was meant to imply, but I'll explain the problem anyway. All feathers are light. Things that are light are not dark. Therefore, no feathers are dark. Does the fact that I don't specify which definition of light I'm using make this argument valid?
As you wrote in the video, the fallacy of equivocation is assuming what is true of one definition of a word must be true of another. If by light you mean the same thing in both P1 and P2, then it isn't an equivocation fallacy. Now, the argument might not be sound because the empirical evidence doesn't show that all feathers are light in color, but it is actually valid, and I'm not really sure how the soundness of all feathers being white is analogous to causation. Again, since William Lane Craig is talking about causation in general, which includes creation ex nihilo, he is not using the equivocation fallacy.
Fine, call the universe a thing. It's still a set of things, and to assume that what's true of those things must be true of the universe as a whole is a fallacy of composition.
This is what you seem to believe we are saying. However, once again, William Lane Craig never actually made this argument. What William Lane Craig has consistently said is that whatever begins to exist requires a cause. Whether the universe is composed of things we have observed beginning to exist by a cause is inconsequential. If the universe was not composed of things we have observed beginning to exist by a cause, William Lane Craig would still be making this argument because, according to him, everything that begins to exist requires a cause. Everything includes more than just things that are composed of things that we have observed beginning to exist by a cause. Once again, the fallacy only comes from you changing what he actually says. Now, atheists have been continuously trying to argue that the experience doesn't support the idea of creation ex nihilo because we have only ever observed ex materia causation. Okay, but take this further. Really, you have only ever observed a few specific examples of material things requiring a cause to begin to exist. So what makes you think the next material thing that comes about will require a cause? If we apply the same reasoning the atheists are using, we have no justification for this because while we may have observed, say, forks requiring causes to begin to exist, we have never observed, say, stars requiring a cause to begin to exist. What atheists do, however, is make a general principle that everything material begins to exist requires a cause. This is all William Lane Craig does, except he says all things that begin to exist, period, require a cause. There is the same amount of justification at this point for that premise as there is for the atheist premise. The support for the first premise goes further than this, however. We realize that when things change, they only do so if they have the potential to do so. A billiard ball has a potential to move in X direction, but that potentiality can only be actualized by something actual in respect to that potential. This is what we observe. What is necessary is that the cause has something to impart to the effect, which explains why we see that the particular effect and not another. Whether this thing is in space and time or not is ultimately irrelevant to the general principle. As long as the cause is actual with respect to that potentiality, it has the power to cause that potentiality to become actual. To limit causes to the material seems quite arbitrary. That is, of course, when you do not consider the fact that these are atheists making the argument to avoid the conclusion that God exists. Now, you may say, yes, causation requires the cause to impart something to the effect, but creation ex nihilo does not allow this because it is creating things from nothing. Not exactly, because according to the Christian idea of creation ex nihilo, there was never a time before the universe. Really, there is no change from nothing to something. According to St. Thomas Aquinas, creation is not change, except according to a mode of understanding. William Lane Craig said, I have again, with Thomas Aquinas, explicitly rejected the idea that creation is a type of change or transition. Again, the causation here is timeless because God is imparting existence to the thing that exists, or rather, these things are participating in God's existence, independent of space and time. We will get more into simultaneous causation later in this video. But furthermore, what you are really suggesting is that if the universe were to begin to exist, since it isn't a case where something comes from something else, it doesn't require a cause. So what you are saying is that things can come from nothing for no reason at all. Do you not see the absurdity of this? It is obviously not the case that things are just popping into existence for no reason at all, so this view is not supported by the empirical evidence. It is also the most irrational position you could ever possibly take on any subject.
There are many degrees of certainty. Yes, I think the universe did have a beginning, in the sense that I think time had a first moment. However, to use a courtroom analogy, if I were in the jury and the universe stood accused of having a beginning, I would vote not guilty. I believe the universe is guilty as charged, and that there is evidence to back this up, but there's more than reasonable doubt.
Assume for the sake of the argument, William Lane Craig's argument is sound. If you believe the universe began to exist with 100% certainty, and William Lane Craig's argument is sound, then it would follow that you believe that God exists with 100% certainty. Now, if you believe the universe began to exist, but there is reasonable doubt, and William Lane Craig's argument is sound, then you must also believe God exists, but there is reasonable doubt. You would be a theist. Ultimately, all William Lane Craig needs to prove is that it is more reasonable than not to believe that the universe had a beginning, as William Lane Craig said himself.
In saying that the cosmogonic evidence confirms 2, I am not saying that we are certain that 2 is true. Too many people mistakenly equate knowledge with certainty. When they say that we do not know that the universe began to exist, what they really mean is that we are not certain that the universe began to exist. But of course, certainty is not the relevant standard here. The question is whether 2 is more plausible in light of the evidence than it's contradictory. Professor Carroll reminds us, science isn't in the business of proving things. Rather, science judges the merits of competing models in terms of their simplicity, clarity, comprehensiveness, and fit to the data. Unsuccessful theories are never disproven, as we can always concoct elaborate schemes to save the phenomena. They just fade away as better theories gain acceptance. Science cannot force you to accept the beginning of the universe. You can always concoct elaborate schemes to explain away the evidence. But those schemes will not fare well in displaying the aforementioned scientific virtues. Even many who have expressed skepticism about premise 2 admit that it is more plausibly true than not. For example, in my recent dialogue with Lawrence Krauss, he volunteered, "I bet our universe had a beginning, but I am not certain of it." Based on the physics that I know, I'd say it is a more likely possibility. This is to admit precisely what cosmologists like Alexander Vilenkin have contended all along, that the evidence makes it more likely than not that the universe began to exist.
Well, yes, but that's not an example of time-independent or simultaneous causation. Forces don't propagate instantaneously. Or is Craig actually under the impression that forces propagate at infinite velocity?
No, saying something is caused simultaneously does not entail it's caused instantaneously. All saying that the cause and the effect are simultaneous necessarily implies is that the cause producing the effect and the effect being produced are one and the same event. The duration of the event can be various times, but the simultaneous causation doesn't have to involve duration necessarily, because the cause does not need to be prior to the effect, and that is my point. Let me quote Edward Fesser on this. Cause and effect are not two events, but two elements of one event. The basic idea is that to cause is just to produce an effect, and it makes no sense to think of a cause producing without its effect being produced, or an effect being produced without its cause producing it. As Clarke puts it, the cutting of the orange by the knife must be identical with the orange being cut. Otherwise, the knife is not cutting anything at the moment of its cutting, nor is the orange being cut by anything at the later moment of its being cut. Besides, I think whether causation as we observe it is simultaneous or not is ultimately irrelevant to whether God causing the world is possible. William Lane Craig may not exactly agree with my view on this, but the basic idea of the causal relationship between God and the world is that God is giving existence to the world. Surely as an atheist you've heard of Immanuel Kant's famous claim that existence isn't a property of things. The reason this is the case is because existence isn't essential to anything. It is possible to list all the properties of any object and for it to not exist. However, obviously some things do exist. Since existence isn't a property of these things, they must participate in existence with something that cannot be conceived without existence. In other words, since no thing is its own existence, things that exist must participate in existence from something that has existence essentially. What is important is that things that exist receive their existence from something that is existence, that exists necessarily, and this is what we call God. To me, this is a causal relationship because these things would not exist if they did not participate in God's being. Now, you may be so entrenched in your idea of causation involving change that you will not budge, but then we will ultimately just be arguing semantics because what I have proposed is possible, indeed it is necessary, regardless of whether you want to call it a causal relationship or not. Again, this is philosophy, not physics. In fact, your position of causes being prior to their effects was not proposed by a physicist, it was proposed by the philosopher David Hume. I've taken both courses in physics and philosophy. In physics, you talk about forces, vectors, and stuff like that. They don't teach you causes are prior to the effect. The first philosophy course I've taken, however, we did talk about David Hume and causality. Strangely, you want to say William Lane Craig's premises are founded on physics, but you also want to say they are not founded on physics because physics doesn't talk about causality. So William Lane Craig is not even wrong. I'm sorry, but you can't say William Lane Craig is wrong when he says his arguments are philosophical arguments. It's physics, and then say he's wrong because his arguments are not physics. That's one of the most illogical tricks I've ever heard anyone try to pull. So stop setting up straw men and actually address what William Lane Craig says. As I've said before, I'm not a fan of William Lane Craig, So I might even agree with you then, but I cannot sit here and agree with this nonsense.